Ladies and gentlemen, good day to you and thank you for your interest in this webinar from Osmond Ergonomics. I'm Guy Osmond, I'm Managing Director of Osmond Ergonomics, and we are the UK's most knowledgeable supplier of innovative products and services to improve workplace wellbeing and productivity. We've been in the business of workplace ergonomics for over 20 years, and so this presentation comes from our view on how the workplace is changing, particularly in the context of what we call the ergonomic tsunami. So what do we mean by that? Well, we're talking about millennials. And millennials, if you're not familiar with the term, also known as Generation Y, are typically individuals born between the start of the 80s and around the turn of the millennium, hence the name. And therefore, they're either just coming into the workplace or have now been in it for a little while. And indeed, some are now getting into management roles. But what we're seeing is many of their attitudes are rather different from what we've been used to in the workplace before. And so we're calling it the ergonomic tsunami because of this change in approach, change in dynamic completely. And in fact, the way we call it, the reason we call it tsunami, is that it's coming, it's enormous, it's unstoppable. Unless we think about it and take some action in anticipation of it and to prepare for it, it's potentially overwhelming. Before I get into this too far, though, I would like to pay particular thanks to two people with whom I've worked on this topic in the past and presented, both in the UK and with some webinars. And both of these gentlemen, Nigel Heaton from Human Applications and Jim Taylor from Orange Box, are both very experienced ergonomists who presented all over the world, and it's been a pleasure to work with them, and also in the case of this presentation to steal a little of their work, but they've kindly agreed for me to do so. So I want to talk about how the workplace overall has changed completely as an ecosystem, and really under these four topics. And I'm going to discuss where the changes are, how I see them, the sort of things one can observe in the workplace, and then make some proposals about how these can be addressed. So the four topics, as you see: workplace, technology, health, and culture. So if we talk about the workplace first, the most significant thing about this is it's no longer a physical location. Anybody who's a knowledge worker, anybody who's a computer worker, simply needs a broadband connection or Wi-Fi or 4G or 5G is coming, and they're pretty much ready to work. So it's no longer a location, it's not a physical place, it's simply an IP address. And obviously this enables people to work in many different ways, and your own organisation or the organisations you work with probably are incorporating some of these sort of things. So the nature of where people work and how they interact has changed and continues to change quite dramatically, and we'll talk about some of those elements as we progress. If we look at the technology, obviously that's moving, technology moves faster and faster, but what we're seeing now is people where historically, not very many years ago, when we first started to get into workplace ergonomics, it was very much about desktop computers. We've seen rapid growth in the last few years of laptop computers, and they now exceed desktop computer sales. But people are doing more and more work on their smartphones, their tablets, and anywhere they can work really with this technology. I've already mentioned about reliable broadband and Wi-Fi connections, 4G, mobile methodologies. Obviously, people are now storing their files in the cloud, which means they can access them from anywhere. They don't have to log into any central server. If they've got a Dropbox or any sort of remote cloud storage, they can get straight to it. Of course, they're communicating as well through social media. So they might just as easily, rather than phoning somebody or sending them an email or even a text, just as easy for some to use Twitter or Facebook to communicate with their friends and indeed their work colleagues. Complicating it still further is the introduction of bring your own devices opportunities within organisations, and many employers are now introducing BYOD programs. And of course the complications with this is where historically the nature of the equipment used by the individual was dictated by their employer. They were issued with some sort of device and told which applications they could use on it, how they would work, how they would communicate. What's now happening is people are bringing their own phone or tablet or whatever the device is into work and saying, look, connect me up, this is what I want to use. We're also obviously seeing big changes in the technology with the Internet of Things, where I saw only recently a Bluetooth enabled, a Wi-Fi enabled coffee making machine. I don't quite understand why it's necessary to actually order your coffee from your own home as you're driving home in the car. It seems to me just as easy to put the kettle on or turn the coffee machine on when you get home. But obviously in this racing time in which we live, every moment counts, and I suppose it's quite cool to be able to connect to your coffee machine before you even get home, whether or not that's actually essential. And then, of course, the other thing we're starting to see, we've seen it a lot already in manufacture, is the business of robots. And so robot technology is well established in making cars and obviously all sorts of big manufacturing processes. But we're now starting to see rapidly artificial intelligence taking over the roles of individuals, and we're expecting to see more of this happening. So although robots you might think of as some physical device that actually has arms or replicates physical activities of a human body or a human person in the manufacturing role, we're already seeing things like translation devices, Google Maps, all of these things, Siri, listening to our voice, interpreting that, acting on it. And of course, as we all know, driverless cars, the technology there is moving very fast. So the nature of how we interact with one another and the resources available for us to do so are changing very, very fast, and continue that. It seems to be accelerating. To the extent that this is just something I think is probably quite typical of the thinking of young people today, and it's quite a common thing we come across. That you'll be familiar with Maslow's hierarchy, which for very many years worked perfectly well with 5 levels. Now, jokingly perhaps, but it's becoming more and more a serious issue, that young people, the millennials coming into the workplace, adolescents, even our children or our children's children, depending on our age, expect to be constantly connected. And so Wi-Fi is almost more important than food and drink and water and breathing. So the cultural issues, obviously, that's an intergenerational thing. This is not just about millennials. It's equally the case that different generations have different attitudes, and we all talk as we grow older of different views on different generations about how they look at life. But obviously what we're seeing is young people coming in have very dramatically different attitudes to work. And so there's therefore a potential conflict or a potential disparity in attitude and approach which needs to be addressed. One of those common expressions that I find interesting is we talked for a long time about the issues of work-life balance, the need for somebody who's in work not to work too long hours. Work-life balance most commonly is perceived as being about excessive hours, so getting home at a sensible hour in the evening, spending time with the family, not working weekends, taking holidays. That's what work-life balance used to be about. Now there's talk of work-life integration. So millennials quite often will more or less expect to have Facebook access or WhatsApp or Snapchat access whilst they're working either on their personal phone or even on their work phone or work device, and expect to be able to be communicating with friends and staying in touch with friends and family during the working day, but will be much more relaxed about dealing with business emails or the occasional call or picking up on business activities in what would traditionally be known as out of work hours. So rather than defining the work-life balance as being don't work too long, go home, and then in the evening and the weekend your time is your own, it's much more of a mishmash of time out for odd little activities during the normal working day that are personal, but equally being prepared to take time out of personal activity evenings and weekends to deal with work-related issues. Confidentiality is something that really is not yet widely regarded, as far as I'm aware. There may well have been stories that I just haven't seen or they've been kept quiet. But issues of confidentiality, I think, will become more of a topic. Organisations already talk about security issues in the use of technology in so many different ways, and hacking stories we see regularly, very big hacking stories. But my view of the confidentiality issue is a generation that will ask all their friends on Facebook about major decisions in their life. Should they get their hair cut? Should they grow a beard? Should they paint their fingernails? Should they start going out with somebody or stop going out with somebody? These seem to be what I would regard as private decisions and private discussions very often between immediately friends and family. But millennials who've been brought up what I would call at one time the Facebook generation, they're just used to sharing all these ideas and thoughts and questions with one another through their social media, through their chatting and texting methodologies. And therefore, it's quite important to just keep in mind that perhaps when they think about all those selfies that are so commonly taken, what the background is to those selfies. I know there are many things, pictures of people with interesting or amusing things going on in the back of a selfie, but it's going to be far less amusing if the information in the back of that selfie, in the background of that selfie, is a new unreleased product, or as an example of something that's being beta tested, or sales figures or confidential data on a that's being discussed on a whiteboard behind, or whatever. So I don't think they think of these things, and therefore it needs to be kept in mind. Similarly, the methods of communication, it always amuses me that smartphone is probably a complete misnomer. A phone is actually about the last thing it's used for by young people today, is actually making a phone call. Indeed, they will talk about conversations with friends and family and work colleagues, and by conversation they mean any exchange of communication, may not actually be, as it once meant, specifically speaking to one another. So they'll talk about conversations which might have been an exchange of texts or WhatsApp. It could be an online conversation of another sort. It could be texting or email, but actually it may not even have been speaking to one another. And speaking to one another is quite often, as I say, the last thing people do. I was talking to somebody only recently who had an email from the person who sits next to them at work asking when they could schedule a meeting. Now, that may sound a bit extreme, but it's becoming more and more the case that people will tap out an email rather than getting up and moving around. And then that brings about a conversation about etiquette. So perhaps that sort of behavior is part of a corporate etiquette, what you do, how you communicate with people, the methodology. But equally, it's, again, if you have teenage or have had teenage children, or perhaps you're coming to that, pretty much all teenagers have mobile phones of some sort these days. And when my own son was a teenager, we had to make it a rule pretty early on that mobile phones were not allowed at the table. Otherwise, when we're sitting down for dinner, otherwise you'd find they're dealing with texts and messages from friends all the way through. And it's if you're not careful, you suddenly find that traditional communication goes out the window. People will look at their phone and take it out of their pocket when it buzzes while you're in the middle of a conversation with them. They'll be in a meeting and suddenly something will buzz or click and they'll look at that. So behavior and what's regarded as the norm or what's regarded as acceptable can be very different, and different attitudes amongst, typically it's generational, but obviously depending how people are involved and use the technology would dictate how they respond to it. So we get a sort of contradiction here, because, and this is some stuff particularly that I'm grateful to Nigel Heaton for, from stuff he'd done some research on. Young people have this sort of self-awareness, which means that they have a sort of a sense that they're indestructible, that nothing bothers them, that they can actually battle on and nothing's really going to get them down. They don't associate themselves with they don't associate poor posture, for example, with the problems of back issues, musculoskeletal problems, and quite often they can think that those are problems relating to old people. And so on the one hand, you have young people who just aren't interested in the things that we regard as common sense and important to maintain good posture, to look after their bodies and so forth, because they think at their age they just don't have to worry about it, because they don't relate existing behavior to future issues. And then on the other hand, we find young people who are already suffering from problems. So we're coming across, if you talk to any physiotherapist or osteopath or chiropractor about the median age of the people they're treating, that's just coming down and down all the time. And when we started in the workplace ergonomics business about just over 20 years ago, we were finding most of the people we encountered with musculoskeletal problems were more commonly ladies in their 50s, because historically they've been doing secretarial or typing work. That was how the demographic mixed up. We're now talking to much younger people, from time to time, people literally who just come into work. And if you talk to chiropractors, say osteopaths, physios, they are treating people in their teens or even younger than that for musculoskeletal problems. So where people have been using computers or computer devices, whether that's tablets, phones, whatever, perhaps in very poor postures for long periods, they can actually come into the work with pre-existing musculoskeletal disorders. And of course, as we're aware, young people now seem to suffer from stress much more than, there's more evidence of stress, whether that's because we understand it more, whether we talk about it more, I don't know. But on the one hand, as I say, there are these indestructible young people coming in saying, I don't have to worry about any of this. I'm bulletproof. I can just get on with my life. And on the other hand, you're finding people who are already showing signs of psychosocial or physical problems, which 20 years ago we would have associated with people much older than we do now. So here's an example of some research that Nigel found, European studies. I'll give you a moment to look at this. I won't actually read it out loud because it's all pretty straightforward. But what I was also, as I'm showing you this, going to point out is if you want to know more from this, we use Google Scholar quite a lot to find research. If you're not familiar with the Google Scholar page, then like Maps or the other Translate or the other tools that Google has, you just type in scholar.google.co.uk and it brings up a search engine which specifically looks for research materials. And here's an example. If you go to scholar.google.co.uk and do a search on adolescent musculoskeletal injuries, computer, video, because those are the sort of words that come up, as you can see, there's over 7,000 results, and the first few show exactly the sort of research that's available readily on to find on different topics around pain and musculoskeletal problems amongst young people, and particularly adolescents. So these are the sort of things we're encountering. If you then think about the commercial impact of that, when we, as I say, when we started in the workplace ergonomics business and we were helping people with perhaps back problems who were in their 50s, these were manifestations that were starting to come about then. If you then think about what the difference it makes if somebody starts to show signs in their 20s rather than their 50s, it's dramatic in terms of the impact on the individual and the cost to their employer. So the sums are very straightforward. If you assume that a back problem will have an average time off work of about 10 days per episode, and you can pick any number you want, the multiplications just apply the same. But this is some stuff from Nigel again. And assume there's about 5 years between each of the episodes. Sorry, forgive me just one moment. And then, so typically 5 years average between the episodes. So by the time somebody is retiring at 21, then 10 episodes has caused them 100 days. Whereas if that was happening at 51, then it would only be 20 days. So you can see how much difference that's going to be. So those are some of the issues we need to look at. So now let's talk about what we can do to start to address those. So the first thing to say is look at your assessment processes, because if they're designed for a historic situation, they need to be reviewed. Perhaps you're already doing that as part of your regular continuous improvement, but it's worth revisiting. Look at your training, not just the topics of the training and the nature of what you're covering, but actually the methods by which you're delivering it. Look at your product portfolio. So if, for example, and this is an area obviously where we get involved, and I'll talk a little more about how we do that further on, but if you have particular products that are approved for addressing particular needs, then just see whether A, those products are continuing to be available, B, whether they're the latest and best to do that sort of job, and see whether there are other products you should be looking at to add to that portfolio. And finally, I suppose I would say that because I'm a potential supply partner, look at the people you're dealing with, see if they're up to speed, see if they're equipped to help you address these issues, and if you're not, maybe it's time to look around. So, your assessment process. I mentioned earlier that when we started, just after the first DSE regulations came into place in the UK, just at the end of 92, and the 93 they actually came into play. 92 is when we started in the business. We were typically being asked to see ladies in their late 40s or early to mid 50s. That was the most common demographic we were addressing. what we were finding then was we're reacting to the particular needs of somebody who had developed problems in their workplace. But as I say, what we found now is a lot of the problems people will bring with them into work from their youth and adolescence. So it's no good being reactive and waiting for it to crop up, because particularly if these are individuals who think they're bulletproof, they've actually had poor posture, they are maintaining poor posture, and they're just so far not noticing anything, then obviously you're riding for a fall, because there are going to be big problems in the future. So you have to be much more proactive. And that's really the most important thing, to just review, obviously, things like the workstation assessment process, but are you covering all the elements of those risk assessments that you need to cover? Are you taking into account how much time they spend in the car, how much time they're driving? Are you taking into account the nature of the equipment they're using, the processes, the locations? Are they smart workers? Are you taking everything into account? I was talking to a customer the other day who was saying that they still mainly focus on a workstation DSE assessment, which is almost irrelevant for a high proportion of the employees, because they now run an agile working program where people hardly ever come into the office, many of them. And so the setup that's being assessed is probably the least used in a typical working week. But obviously you need to take that out more broadly to the nature of their activities, not just their DSE use, but look at their device use and so forth, and other elements to their work and the risks they're taking. And also something to keep in mind and address if you can is, what are they doing outside work? So are they doing a lot of video game use? Are they gaming, whether that's Nintendo type games, Mario, or sorry, I've gone blank on these characters, the Sonic the Hedgehog, so forth. Any of those people are actually gaming of the poker type. And people are doing these things quite often, or if they're playing role-play games and team games online and so forth, these become very time-consuming, and they spend a lot of time on them once they get into that interest. So not only are they taking activities keyboard-type activities that may impact the demands on their body and their postures and their musculoskeletal issues and pains and so forth, but there's also potentially a risk of sleep deprivation, and that's obviously another big impact on people's health and well-being. So looking at how you train them and the things you train them and the messages to convey, we've been using, for example, you may be aware of our posture guidance that we've been looking at for, we've had in existence since 1997. It's downloadable as a PDF. It's available as an animation online as well, all for free. But actually that may be one way of doing it, but obviously we're now looking at, we have a smartphone version of this which is animated, so it's instantly accessible and free. That's a way to communicate. We're starting to use more and more in the way of video. A lot of organizations are using very short videos that are perhaps only a minute or maybe 2 minutes long at the most, just to give short, sharp, simple messages. And actually the production quality of these things doesn't have to be as if it was actually trying to win an Oscar or a BAFTA. It's actually much more about getting the message across in a short, sharp, succinct way. One of the other things we're also finding is actually you can't just take things for granted in terms of what the rules used to be about how you're explaining things to people and how they use them and what they understand. And the particular thing we're seeing is if you've got somebody coming into the workplace who's been using, whether it's sitting on a bed using their laptop for hours on end, when they've got a peculiar posture they like to use with their bog standard mouse, but if they've been doing that for many, many years, then they will have muscle memory, which just is a pattern that means that the brain anticipates and reacts and responds and thinks about the way that's being done and takes it for granted. So if you then say to them, no, here's a different mouse, and you hold it like this, if it's completely different, what might seem just obvious to you will be completely counterintuitive to them. And my picture is just an example. When I was younger, this is actually quite an older gentleman, as you can see, because you can see from the beard, but he's left-handed. And the point I wanted to illustrate is when I was at school, children were often we were writing with fountain pens, and left-handers developed this peculiar sort of posture with their writing style, which would mean that they didn't smudge the ink as they were writing across it. when it wasn't yet dry. And so that's a similar scenario we're starting to see with young people when we're trying to set them up in what we think are reasonably obvious postures that we can demonstrate to them and we hope they will get and understand and adapt to. Sometimes we're finding that actually they don't get it at all because it's so very different from what they're used to, however bad what they're used to actually is, however bad for them. Something to just touch on here, it's not directly relevant to all of this physical ergonomics, but it's something that we regard as a really big issue. And I do run webinars on email management from time to time. So if that's of interest, watch out for our free webinar site, which is ergonomics.events. That's all you need to type into your browser and you can see what webinars like this one are coming up. We do something on email management. I regard that as an essential part of training to improve productivity. It's not about physical ergonomics, but it's very much about improving productivity. And I've never met anybody who would like more email. Most people say it's a deluge they don't quite cope with. There are a whole number of quite simple measures one can take to actually address what you do with your email, how you time manage it, and actually striving towards the concept of inbox zero. And for many of us, nothing in your inbox is aspirational, and some just think that would be nirvana, that would be impossible to ever get to. But it can be done. And so amongst the training, when you're looking at ways to engage people and get them interested in the training program and looking at different tools, it may well be that bringing email management into the overall discussion will be something that everybody will relate to. And I always say that in a 30 to 40 minute presentation, I can guarantee to give people at least 2 or 3 tips that will save them 10 minutes a day. And I think all of us would love to save 10 minutes a day. And if you could do more than that, and many do, that's well worth looking towards. As I say, it's ergonomics.events is our page for webinars and seminars and so forth, and they're free, and I just run them periodically, typically about once a quarter if you're interested. And then finally, etiquette. I touched on that before, but actually I think it now needs to be training needs to be provided about etiquette to actually just explain to people what is reasonable behavior, and that's all that etiquette is. What is acceptable behavior to everybody? I know that many hubs and touchdown organizations and lounges and so forth have standards for things like, for example, don't carry on long and loud telephone conversations with somebody who's driving a lorry so that you have to shout at them constantly. So just simple things like behavior around mobile phone use, leaving the room, but also just general behavior etiquette about behavior and guidelines. If you're using sit-stand desks, obviously what are the protocols and how to use those, encouraging behavior like walking meetings, using the stairs rather than the lifts. There's a large number of things that can be integrated into this that can actually be part of your general health and well-being program, and all of these topics can be brought into that, and you can be delivering that by as many different methods as possible, not just by a poster on the wall, which used to be the way most information was conveyed, but use your internal social media, whether it's Link or Chatter or any of the other mechanisms that are available. So you've got quick chat methods. You can use video screens on the walls around the premises. Moving pictures convey more and more quickly than still pictures. So there are a number of other ways, social media type methodology to get short, sharp messages to people in bite-sized pieces, I think really is the name of the game here. And if you're going to be doing that, you need to review your resources, because obviously if you've got a bunch of handouts that you've been using for many years that may contain the basic content, but it may not look very attractive, may not be very engaging, and may not hit the spots for people who want to, the way they want to connect with them, then things like social media messages, pictures, infographics, all of these sort of things need to be used as you need to be looking at updating everything so that it looks as though it's 21st century training for 21st century personnel, rather than stuff that's been good for you so far, so why change it? So the product portfolio, obviously this is an area where we do a lot of work. What we typically find when we engage or we're engaged by a new customer, And particularly we found this on a number of occasions with American employers who are looking to roll out a similar program for Europe as they have already in the US. Very often there's an approved product list, and I'm talking specifically here in the DSE area, computer workstations, but similar situations apply elsewhere for personal protective clothing and equipment and so forth. But we find in these lists that there's products that are simply not available anymore. We find there are products that have been replaced by better products, and the legacy devices are still being bought when there's a newer one, a better one, possibly even a cheaper one available. People carry on buying the old stuff until it's just no longer available. And as I say, then we find stuff is on lists that actually hasn't been available for a while. It's also important, and this is a difficult one, to find out what your IT departments are planning to do in terms of future deployment. Very often nobody quite knows. The first thing they hear about it is when suddenly people are given a new tablet or a new laptop, and this is a new issue that nobody was aware of until it suddenly happens. But if you are going to start, if your employer is going to start issuing tablets, what are you thinking about in terms of how those are going to be used, how people are going to be trained, what posture guidance is going to be given? Are they going to need separate keyboards, or are they going to need stands, or are they going to need something to go with them? Similarly with laptops and so forth. So if you've got new programs and products being issued, it's really important to understand what's coming, or try and find out what's coming and anticipate it, rather than forever being trying to run to catch up to find out once they've already gone out. Obviously, if your employer, your organization, or your client has a bring your own devices policy, that's even more complicated, because you're then needing to deal with a population of products you don't actually even know what they are, but you need to try and anticipate. So you probably need to be looking at more generic products. So if you're looking, for example, at tablets, you need to look at devices that will work with a selection of 7-inch or 10-inch tablets, rather than perhaps a keyboard that is dedicated to a particular manufacturer or model. And so when you're looking at that list, as I say, you need to look at it regularly. Has it been added to? Has it taken into account changing needs? These are just a couple of products. The WorkFit T on the left, which we supply, which is a sit-stand adapter to go on a fixed height desk. So people who want to convert an existing desk or table to offer a sit-stand capability, adapters are available. For tablets, the tablet riser on the right is a product that we find more and more people are using tablets as laptop replacements. So things that historically they would do with a laptop, they're now doing with a tablet, which means they're spending more and more times on their tablets. So the tablet riser is basically a little aluminium case, like a little mini attaché case, which includes holds a tablet inside and a detachable or a removable Bluetooth mini keyboard. The whole lot folds down into a carryable unit with a handle, but it opens out into something that provides height adjustment of the tablet, angle adjustment of the tablet, so you can get you can't get an optimum posture, but you can get a much improved posture when you're looking at it. Separate keyboard, obviously much more practical for protracted keying than doing it onto the screen. So a couple of little examples that have been available for a comparatively short time. Are these products you ought to be thinking about? Have you got something to address these sort of issues? Do you need it? Maybe you don't, but maybe you do, and nobody's even given it a thought. And then finally, supply partners. Obviously, there's some quite significant cultural and procedural changes I've covered here in this topic, which means that you need to be making sure you're dealing with people who can offer this sort of thing. So these are just a couple of examples of things we do. Obviously, we're in the ergo products market. We work with organizations who manufacture furniture that responds to the changing workplace. So the nature of the office and the working environment generally physically is changing, as well as all these other technology and thinking and procedural and attitude issues that I've already raised. So you need to be talking to suppliers and manufacturers of products that allow for different types of working for collaboration and communication spaces, which typically might be open plan or hot desking, but equally concentration and contemplation places, so areas where people can have a quiet time, either to think something through or to concentrate on something they're doing, or some strategy time. So important to think about how people are working and find out whether you've got suppliers that offer those sort of things. And Jim Taylor from Orange Box that I mentioned, he's been very much involved in research about mobile generations. The book you can see on the left-hand side, and workplace well-being is a big topic that Orange Box and Jim in particular have been working with. We also work with Cardinus, who have a number of, who are an assessment and e-learning company, so they can offer online assessment, but online training as well, and a lot of other support mechanisms, including information about young people and their attitudes and how they can set up. They have a website called ergonomics4kids.com, which is ergonomics4kids.com. And on that, there's a cartoon for children to look at to learn about posture and ergonomics, and in a way that they can relate to. And then there's a sort of teenage section for the 11 to 18-year-olds, and then obviously beyond the 18-year-olds, there's a typical workplace type setup guidance. We also have a number of resources which you can access, things like, this is an example of one of our guidance things for some tips for sit-stand users, so that they actually get benefit if they actually go for some sort of sit-stand workstation, get benefit from it. We just recently launched a document for handheld devices, some guidance about the sort of things to be thinking about when using handheld devices. This sort of thing's readily available and for free, and I will give you in just a moment some details of where you can find all this information. So as I say, you can actually find us on Google, or if you search Guy Osmond, you can find me pretty rapidly with a bit of luck. We're on all 9 of these different social media methodology. Well, one of them is just email, but I blog, we podcast, we're on Google+, YouTube, Pinterest, Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. So you can find us through any of those, or you can email me, guy.osmond@ergonomics.co.uk. If you request a copy of if you'd like a copy of the screens as a PDF, then just email me mentioning that you've seen this presentation, and I'll be happy to get one of my colleagues to zap it over to you. But equally, if you go to osmondgroup.co.uk, then you will find access to all of our social media, and loads of these resources are all from one central point. Or if you want to look at some of the products we do, we're at ergonomics.co.uk, because a very long time ago, I thought this whole interweb thing might take off one day, so we registered ergonomics.co.uk before anybody else thought it was important. So I'm done now. If you have any questions, do feel free, please, to email them to me. But aside from that, thank you very much for your time, and I